Hello, my name is Buddy Childress, and I'm Executive Director of Needles Eye Ministries. We are really happy to have you with us today for a monthly speaker series. We hope you enjoy it. Justice Bill Mims, I have known for several years. We attend church together, among other things. However, some things you may not know about the Justice. He is a graduate of William & Mary and GW Law School. He has been not only on the Supreme Court, as he is now, but he's also been the Attorney General, the Chief Deputy Attorney General of the Commonwealth, member of the House of Delegates, and a member of the Virginia Senate. So he's got a tremendous background not only in practicing law, but in being a representative of the people. He and Jane have 3 daughters, 2 of whom are grown. One is in college. And one of the most, I think, impressive things about Justice Bill Mims is when you get to know him just a little bit, you really see what type of an individual he is, somewhat, if you will, self-deprecating. Because when we ask him for pictures for a piece that we sent out, how many of you got one of these in the mail? Let me ask you also, how many of you have read one of his columns in Faith and Values in the Times-Dispatch? So you know who we're talking about. Well, we got 3 pictures, and we could not choose, so we ran them all. We have one, certainly, we have one in his robe, which he uses in his profession, obviously, when they're seated. One like he about looks now, but the one I'm really impressed with is the one as a jogger. He has little running shorts on, and he's got short, a hat. His hands are covered, but his legs are not, nor his arms. This is the kind of person Bill Mims is. So, would you help me welcome our speaker today, the Honorable Justice William Mims.
Buddy, if you are impressed with the legs of a 57-year-old man, you've got problems I can't solve.
Just that you let everyone see.
Well, then I've got problems that you can't solve. Well, I got to tell you, thank you for being here and listening to me for a few minutes. The most important thing I want to say is happy birthday to my brother who is here. David, I have a card for you. I'm cheap. I'm so glad you're here. I didn't have to spend 50 cents on a stamp. I'll give it to you later if you're nice to me. My brother David was instrumental in my early faith walk, and I'm really very pleased that he could be here all the way from Lexington, Virginia. And I begin my talk by quoting him, because when I was a practicing lawyer, David came up to me one day and he said, "Hey, I figured out what you do. You're in the strife business." And I said, "I beg your pardon?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "You take little disputes and you turn them into big disputes. And then you charge a whole lot of money. And right before trial, you enter into settlements that no one understands, and to the extent they do understand it, they don't like it. And somehow you convince your clients that you've done them a service and they pay your bill." And he goes, "What a country." And, I said, "Yeah, I disagree with that, but oh well." But the interesting thing is, when I became a judge, I realized that if I was in the strife business before, I had moved to the justice business. And it really caused me to think about what judges do. And it was with some element of chagrin, because I had actually spent 30 years from the beginning of law school until the day I became a judge, and not once had I really pondered what is justice. So being in the justice business now, I have now spent several years trying to ask, what is justice? And as I did so, as I started to do readings both on the legal side and on the faith side, I realized that there's actually a more important question that precedes what is justice, and that is, what does it mean to be just? And those are the 2 questions that I'd like to address today. And as I do so, I'm going to offer what I would call a new old paradigm. And that new old paradigm is that justice is composed of rights, responsibilities, and righteousness, or mercy. Being in the justice business is something that I have done as a lawyer and a judge for 30 years. But as I continued to think about it, I realized that when I first started to follow Jesus at the age of 15, I got into the justice business without realizing it. And I would suggest that no matter what each of you do for your profession, no matter where you are in your faith walk, that all of us are in the justice business. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. Americans talk about justice constantly. There is the dictionary definition, and I'm not going to take any time to read it aloud because it doesn't really say that much. But when you think about it, justice is our civic mantra as Americans. Did you know that in Virginia public schools, we begin that civic mantra in kindergarten? The kindergarten SOL requires our 5-year-old children to learn the Pledge of Allegiance, which I think is a good thing. And that ends with liberty and justice for all. So from the very first days of school, we are talking about justice. Our leaders promise justice. Some even strive for it. Martin Luther King's most famous speech drew from the prophet Amos, where he talked about that he would not be satisfied until justice rolled down like waters, righteousness like a mighty stream. Lawyers and judges even recognize that justice can sometimes trump the law. There is a doctrine that is more than 600 years old called the ends of justice exception. And it allows judges to say that when the strict application of the law would be unjust, then you are allowed to step in and do equity and formulate an equitable resolution that actually is different than the harsh letter of the law might call for. In our political debates, we actually cloak our arguments in justice, perhaps without even realizing it. How often in debates or discussions have you heard someone talk about a just war, or a just society, or a just wage? What they're doing very, very subtly is saying, my position is just, consequently your position must be unjust. So we even use justice for our advantage when we are in the political or the policy spheres. We constantly talk about justice. But what does it mean? I'm going to suggest that justice is multifaceted and that justice is really more rich, has more depth than we might first think about. In doing so, I want to travel 900 miles from Richmond. I want you to presume to put yourself in Ferguson, Missouri. And we're going to go through and we're going to talk about various folks in Ferguson, Missouri and what justice means to them. We're going to start with Michael Brown's mother. Michael Brown's mother, if you asked her what is justice, she would say it's retribution. It's punishment. Punishment against whom? She would say it's punishment against Officer Darren Wilson. If you put yourself in the shoes of Officer Darren Wilson, justice is the rule of law. It's the ability to not have to testify against yourself. It's the requirement that you have an attorney, and if you can't afford one, one is appointed for you. It's requiring proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's requiring trial by jury. Our rule of law is part of justice in America. If you are a store owner in Ferguson, Missouri, whose store was looted and burned, justice is restitution. You want someone to pay for the harm that was done to you. You want them to pay in a fashion that allows you to rebuild your store. If you are a community organizer, justice is redistribution. It's redistributing opportunities and perhaps political power or economic power among social groups. If you were the police chief, justice is restoration. It is restoration of peace and order. If you're the mayor, the gentleman in the middle of the picture, justice is reunification. It's looking at diverse political constituencies and trying to bring them back together. And finally, if you are a pastor, justice is reconciliation and renewal. You look at justice on a spiritual plane. Those are 8 R's. Teachers tell you there are 3 R's. Get a lawyer in front of the room and it expands to 8. Those are what I call the justice values, but those aren't all of the justice values. Those are simply the ones that apply to the setting that we're talking about. But I would put those justice values into 3 categories. They deal with rights, they deal with responsibilities, but they also deal with righteousness or mercy. And that's where that new old paradigm comes in, because we as Americans tend to think of justice as being rights and responsibilities, and we stop there. So that's why I want you to look at and think of justice in a new way, but it's actually an old way, as we'll talk about. On the secular side, righteousness or mercy in terms of justice is as old as Plato, the first book of the Republic. Now, by the way, if you can't see that from the back, it's a whole bunch of people reading Plato in Philosophy 101. And here's one person, this is me, who brought Play-Doh to the room. I didn't do very well in philosophy. That's on the secular side. If you look on the faith side, justice as righteousness and mercy goes back not only to the prophets, it actually goes back to Deuteronomy. It goes back to the Torah, the oldest parts of our Old Testament. The interesting thing as Americans is when you look at why we think of justice as rights and responsibilities, it's because it's part of our DNA. Thomas Jefferson, rights, the Declaration of Independence. James Madison, responsibilities, the United States Constitution. They weren't terribly concerned with righteousness or mercy because they were building a nation. They had a lot of important things they were doing. But we tend to focus on those 2 documents and how they have played out through 225 years of American history. But there were 2 leaders in our country who did focus on righteousness and mercy, for whom justice really was a broader, a deeper topic. And they were Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King. And they grounded their concept of justice in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I'll come back to that. But before I do, I don't want to leave us in Ferguson, Missouri. I want to bring us back to Richmond, Virginia. And I want to really put this talk into a getting real context for all of us. Are we achieving the 8 justice values? I live in the west end of Richmond. I took a look at my census tract the other day, or my census block, and the neighborhood in which I live is almost 100% white, almost 100% native born, almost 100% college graduates, almost 100% of us own our own homes, and the average household income exceeds $200,000. If you ask in my neighborhood, are we achieving the justice values? I'm guessing most of the people would say, yeah, we are. Friends of mine just moved to East Highland Park. That's Brooklyn Road that goes right through the middle of their neighborhood. They moved there because they wanted to do justice. Their neighborhood is mostly African American, but with about 1/4 immigrant. 11% of the people there have graduated from college. Most of the people rent their homes, and the average income per household is $48,000. I would suggest this. The answer to the questions in that neighborhood are we achieving the justice values, are as important, if not more important, than the answers in my neighborhood as we try to build a dynamic and forward-looking group of urban communities. Now that is a brief talk about what is justice, the second part of that equation that I mentioned. The first part of the equation is, what does it mean to be just? Because I truly believe that we cannot work for justice as a society unless each of us individually is focused on what does it mean to be just. The rights and responsibilities that are societal are preceded by the righteousness and mercy that come from each member of the society. Now, we don't usually think in terms of, is a person just? So, let me put up someone that we would all recognize and say, was Mother Teresa just? You probably have never thought of that before, but immediately your answer, I hope, is, well, absolutely. You know, probably the most just individual that we've seen in our generation. Okay. We all know Buddy Childress. Is Buddy Childress just? Probably never asked that question before either. Now, this might come as a surprise, but Buddy Childress is no Mother Teresa.
Not a surprise.
But I would say that Buddy Childress is a just individual. We just don't usually use those terms. And I think it's important that we start to use those terms. Being just is the predicate, is the necessary foundation for seeking justice. This is what I'm going to talk about as in studies that will follow this Getting Real series. I'm going to base it on the book Generous Justice by Tim Keller, because that's where we really can unpack the being just, doing justice concept, this new old paradigm that I talked about. And there's no time today to go in depth with that, but Tim Keller begins with the Hebrew Bible and the concepts of justice there. There is that quote from the prophet Amos about letting justice roll down. The concept of justice there is the Hebrew word mishpat. The word mishpat also appears in one of my favorite scriptures, Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to do justice, to do mishpat, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. But what Keller points out is that justice is, in those terms, is what we certainly understand as Americans, equal justice under law, the rule of law, but that a richer understanding of justice includes another Hebrew word, zedek, which also translates as justice, but it translates as righteousness or social justice, a concern about those other groups that I mentioned. And here's the most fascinating aspect. Justice is also chesed, which means mercy or loving kindness. We Americans tend to put those concepts into silos. I will do justice as a member of the Supreme Court, and then I'll take the robe off and I'll go to church and I'll work perhaps to feed the hungry or to work with Caritas, and I'll do mercy. And those are silos. We think of them separately. Tim Keller points out they all go together. Justice, righteousness, mercy are all part of a complete understanding of what justice is. But that's enough for that right now. As I said, we'll be doing a book study afterwards, and I hope that many of you will come to it. But as I pondered what is justice, I realized something odd as I was also looking through my Bible. Jesus doesn't talk about justice. The word justice appears repeatedly in the Old Testament. But if you do a word study of the King James Version of the New Testament, The word justice appears only twice in the New Testament. Once in the Gospel of Luke, once in Thessalonians. That's it. Why didn't Jesus talk about justice? Was the question that I asked. And then I realized that I had what I would call a well-duh moment. And I remembered what my high school football coach told me. It's a picture of me in high school. I was number 77. My high school football coach said, Mims, for somebody who's as smart as you are, you sure can be dumb sometime. Jesus did talk about justice, but he wasn't focused on government or society. He was focused on individuals. So he wasn't talking about governmental rights or societal responsibilities. He was talking about the righteousness and mercy part of justice. If you do a word study of righteous and righteousness and mercy and merciful, those words appear more than 1,000 times in the Bible, with a huge number of those being in the New Testament. Jesus was saying, if you follow me, if you choose to follow me, I will show you how to seek righteousness, how to do mercy. And what follows is justice will follow from that. So, Jesus was actually constantly talking about justice. What was his most important sermon, most important talk? The Sermon on the Mount. There were 8 Beatitudes. 3 of the Beatitudes focused on justice. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. When he was asked by the Pharisees, what is the greatest commandment? His response was, well, actually, there are 2 of them. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Those 2 commandments are about justice. They actually are about righteousness and mercy when you unpack them. How is that? How do people of faith seek righteousness? You seek righteousness by being in a right relationship with God, by loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind. How do we practice mercy? We practice mercy by loving our neighbor as ourself, by doing unto others as we would have them do unto us. So if you look at the Beatitudes, if you look at the greatest commandments, and if you look at the Golden Rule, all of them focus on righteousness and mercy, which is how we complete justice. We have gone from being just to what is justice. We've gone from Ferguson, Missouri to Richmond, Virginia. We've gone from the Hebrew Bible to the teachings of Jesus. This series is entitled Getting Real. So let's get real about what justice means for us, but in particular, since I've got the microphone, about what justice means for me, and am I doing justice? Tim Keller says in Generous Justice that my greatest obligation as a follower of Jesus is to the poor and the powerless. There are hundreds of references in the Bible to widows, orphans, prisoners, immigrants, the hungry, and the homeless. Those groups have 2 things in common. They had few legal rights, and they had no economic power. That is what connects all of those groups. What Tim Keller calls the quartet of the dispossessed, when he was talking about some of those groups. Those are the groups that we are commanded to reach out to have mercy for, to identify with. Now, those groups had little legal rights and no economic power. Who were the groups, or what was the one group that Jesus saved his harshest condemnation for? The Pharisees. The Pharisees had all the legal rights and all the economic power. Now, were the Pharisees bad people? Absolutely not. They were actually the leaders of the Palestinian society, the Jewish society in the first century. They were the lawyers. They were the judges. They were the people of power. They were me. They were my neighbors. They were the people who I hang out with. And Jesus had his harshest words for them because they didn't do justice in the fashion that we're talking about today. So, how good am I at doing justice? I'm not really nearly as good as I would like for you to believe that I am. I practiced law for 19 years. And during those 19 years, I handled hundreds of cases, including dozens that were large cases, that were significant cases. I was asked a few weeks ago, what was the most memorable case that you handled? And I said, well, you know, there were two of them. Immediately, I remembered two. And I said, the first one involved a lady named Bonnie Wetzel. She was a home daycare provider in Leesburg, Virginia, rather poor. Her husband was a janitor. And he had come home for lunch one day, and he was heading back to work where he was a janitor. And he was driving down a street past a public housing complex, and he was shot and killed randomly. No one was ever caught. No one had anything against him. This was a couple that really didn't harm anyone. But she was left really almost destitute. There was no life insurance. There was no retirement. There was very little. And she sought workers' compensation benefits because he was on the job when this occurred. And went to a couple of attorneys who said, well, you don't really have a case. And then the day before the statute of limitations ran, she came to me, and I actually couldn't tell her that she didn't have a case because I never practiced workers' compensation law. But I started to represent her. And 2 years later, the Court of Appeals of Virginia handed down a decision finding that, that she had the right to workers' compensation benefits, which lasted for 500 weeks and got her to the point where she would then receive full Social Security benefits for herself and her husband, and would be able to live with a reasonable standard of living for the rest of her life. It was a wonderful faith-building experience to get to know her and the people supporting her in the community. The second case involved a couple named Glenn and Alice Douglas, who were very active members of Leesburg Baptist Church, young parents, and tragically they were killed instantly in a fiery crash on Route 15 when a car crossed the median and hit their car head-on, leaving them with two children, two teenagers, in their house without parents. Leesburg Baptist Church really did justice with them for years. One of the children wound up moving with relatives into South Carolina, but another one of those children, a teenager, was first fostered by members of the church and then adopted by members of the church. And 5 years later graduated from college, and then a couple of years after that was married. And during all of that time, I had the privilege of being the lawyer who handled all of the legal work beginning the day after the crash and ending on her 24th birthday when her trust, when the trust that was created was dissolved and the funds were paid over to her individually. Years of legal work were required in that instance. I realized when I answered that question, there was this whisper. Do you know why those were the two most memorable out of the hundreds of cases you handled? Because it was a widow and it was orphans. With all of the work in the justice business that I had done, those were the two times when I was able to do justice in a way unlike other times. Moving to Richmond, there was another example that I didn't even realize at first. I go to the post office each day, and there's a man who begs outside of the post office. He's elderly, he's disabled, Very pleasant person. And I would, give him a few dollars once or twice a month when I would see him. One day I did something totally out of character. He really can't walk very well, so he sits on the wall next to the door. I sat down with him, and I started to chat. I wanted to know, who are you? And I found out his name's Jerry. He grew up in Highland Park, that neighborhood that we talked about. He had troubles early in life. He spent some time in prison. He had alcohol and drug issues. He's a man of faith. His mom led him to the Lord, and he says, I've been clean for 33 years by the grace of God. And we got to know each other that day. And I've really considered him to be a friend ever since then. Let me say this. While I was sitting there, a couple of my Pharisee friends, because I am a Pharisee, a couple of my Pharisee friends walked by, and they thought it was kind of odd, but I thought it was kind of fun. But here's why I share those stories. I don't want you to praise me for any of those three. I did 2 cases in 19 years. We've got legal aid lawyers in this state that do those cases, dozens of them a week, and have been doing that for their entire career for a fraction of the money that I made as a lawyer. I spent 5 minutes talking with Jerry. There are people who are working with the homeless community and the community of those who are dispossessed in this town, in this city, every day of their lives. Those are the people to praise. But we can each do justice in that fashion, and I can do justice to a much greater extent than I already am doing. And here's how. We can work with those who are hungry. Here are some members of our community volunteering for Feed More. We can work with those who are homeless. This is a church doing its work with Caritas. We can work with those who are physically sick through crossover ministry and other ministries. We can work with those who are in prison. We can work within the community. We can mentor at-risk kids. And when we do those things, we will break down the racial and cultural barriers that are preventing us from doing the full justice that the Bible talks about. Now, as I said at the beginning, I've actually been in the justice business ever since I started to follow Jesus. And again, my brother was one of the people who helped me to start on that path. And here's how. A verse that was instrumental in my coming to faith at the age of 15 is tucked away deep in the book of Isaiah. And when I first opened my Bible to read for the very first time to try to understand what faith was, and it was in a moment of desperation. It wasn't an intellectual exercise. The very first words that I read were, "The Spirit of the Lord God is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners." Now think about those groups that we just saw on the screen. The words just and justice do not appear in that verse from Isaiah 61:1. But that verse is all about justice. It is all about righteousness and mercy for those who truly need it. And this isn't only my life verse. You might recognize that verse. That verse also appears in Luke, because when Jesus first began his ministry, the very first public words that he spoke in his ministry were from Isaiah 61:1, and he said, "Today that scripture is fulfilled." So to the extent that we are following in his path, he laid a marker down. He said, "I want you to be Isaiah 61 people. I want you each that follow me to do exactly that." So we are all in the justice business. And as we start to ask, what can we do day to day, week to week, year to year, we individually are each a ripple. Together, we are a mighty wave. Now let me also say, in front of you, as I close, there is a filter, a coffee filter. It has the word justice on it. I want you to take that with you. I was given one of those 20 years ago by an Episcopal minister who worked at the General Assembly. Jack, you remember Fletcher Lowe. Fletcher Lowe, he and I didn't agree on a whole lot of political things, but he was a man all about righteousness and mercy. And one day he handed me a coffee filter with the word justice on it. And he said, Bill, every decision you make, every action you take, pass it through the justice filter. I think that's what we're called to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. We are going to, as we like to do at these events, we're going to take some questions, but we're going to be limited at the most 2. We'll see because of time. So somebody real quickly, who would like to ask the justice a question about justice? It only takes one to get us started.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I live in the neighborhood of North Churchill in the East End.
Yeah.
And yeah, just really resonated with a lot of what you said, but kind of was interested in what holistic justice looks like in terms of, like the overwhelming systematic injustice with the housing projects and the education system and the healthcare providers, and kind of ways that we can attempt to be Christ in the bigger picture, as well as in the individual relationships and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. That is great. And I would say you need to come and be one of the leaders of the book study. That's exactly what Tim Keller talks about. Mishpat is us individually doing whatever we can within our own sphere. Zedek is social justice. It's changing the system. And the interesting thing is that Mishpat and Zedek are not separate concepts within the Old Testament. They are often used together. And they are often also used with the word mercy and loving kindness. And so we have a responsibility as individuals to our neighbor, literally the person living beside us, the person we see on the street. But we also have a societal responsibility to make things more just as a society. I don't want to put you on a pedestal, but those who actually would move into the neighborhood to do justice are truly following in Jesus' footsteps. What does Jesus say? If you look at the Message, John 1, what did Jesus do? He moved into the neighborhood.
Right.
And thank you for moving into the neighborhood.
One more question. And then for those of you who wish, Bill's agreed to stay after, and he would certainly answer questions and maybe talk with a group of you if you want, so keep that in mind as well. Yeah. Time for one more. Really? Is that it?
Okay.
All right. Lee?
Justice as it relates to the McDonald trial.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Let me say this. The Bob McDonald is one of my closest friends. He is a brother in faith. He's someone who I've spent many hours with. We talked about justice in terms of when we looked at those justice values, they include things such as punishment. But the flip side of that aspect of justice is mercy. And without commenting more deeply, I was touched, surprisingly so, by the comments and the occurrences at Judge Spencer's sentencing hearing. Judge Spencer is someone who actually went to divinity school before he went to law school. And so I will, that is something, and I appreciate your asking, that is something that touches me very deeply. But it is an example of how, first of all, how God uses our circumstances. It is an example of how all of us have made mistakes. All of us have committed offenses of one sort or another. And God has shown mercy to each of us and uses us wherever He finds us. So may I leave it at that? Okay. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Bill. A couple of quick comments. Happy birthday, David. There will be a 3-session study on the book by Tim Keller, Generous Justice. Justice Mims will be leading that. It will be on the 17th, 24th of February and the 10th of March. Thank you for coming. I'd like to ask you to bow your heads with me, and I'll have a closing prayer, and we'll be on our way. Lord, thank you so much for Bill's heart and for his commitment to you and for the way that you use him in this community, personally and professionally. My prayer, Lord, is that for each of us that have heard this message today, that you would help us to allow you to filter it into our minds and our hearts, to make us more the people you want us to be. And for those of us who claim the name of Christ, Lord, let us allow your Spirit to mold us more in the areas of righteousness and mercy. And we thank you for that, and we pray it all in his name. Amen.